Ryan Thomas at the East West here, extending a very warm welcome to this very special holiday edition of Scoring with Opus. And this is just going to be a really fun, laid-back session. We're going to break down the soundtrack that you just heard, section by section, and show you how Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra made it happen. And if you've been following the Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra series at all, you might have noticed that most of the demos have tended to be on the darker, more powerful side. But in this one, you'll be able to hear the massive emotional range of these instruments as they're used in the context of something that's quite a bit more magical and delicate. So let's go ahead and just get right into it. And part of what makes this intro so magical is the Nightfall 05 preset in Hollywood Fantasy Orchestrator. You have these beautifully delicate textures in the strings, those dulcimer tremolos, some of the winds, of course, the voices, and even some of the percussion. So let's go ahead and hear the Nightfall 05 preset by itself. It's just really beautiful how all of those elements are evolving in that preset. Now, the only other string content we have at the beginning are just some flautandos in the 18 violins, and then, of course, these arpeggios in the 3 dulcimers. So let's go ahead and hear the strings with orchestrator. Now, we also have this line in the crotales that is following that 3 dulcimer line, and the crotales from Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra percussion are actually bringing a lot of the emotion in this section. So we've got the crotales, and then we're going to go ahead and solo the harp, the tonal hit 05 from Hollywood Orchestrator, which is just harp, celesta, and crotales from Hollywood Orchestra, and then some celesta as well. So let's go ahead and hear the strings with the tuned percussion. So the idea here was just to create this really magical atmosphere, as well as a backdrop for the 2 solo instruments, which in this case are the 2 Irish whistles from Hollywood Fantasy Winds, as well as the solo voice patch from Hollywood Fantasy Voices. And I will go ahead and keep these up so that you can see the key switches that are being triggered in this section. And I've gone ahead and unmuted everything, so here is the full intro. So the writing here is really simple, but you can be really effective, especially when you're working with these really beautiful, inspiring textures. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the key switching in the 2 Irish whistles patch in particular. I think it's very important in this patch if you want to get maximum authenticity. So we're switching between some sustained finger vibratos, some legatos, and then, of course, the glisses or the bends. So here is the 2 Irish whistle patch by itself, and I'm switching to the articulation view so that you can see exactly what's happening. So again, these are beautifully recorded, but if you want that sort of authentic sound, it's definitely going to be to your advantage to do some articulation mapping. Now, in this next phrase, we're introducing the full strings, including the low string patch from Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra, which just has such a beautiful, full sound. And I want to point out that because the cello and the basses were recorded in octaves, if this were parted out, it would actually look like this. So just in case you were wondering, this is what it would look like if you had the cello and the basses in separate tracks. So let's go ahead and undo that and hear the strings by themselves. So now let's go ahead and add the brass. And we just have this one line in the Wagner tubas that I think is actually doubling the cello in that spot. So yeah, it's just adding a bit of texture and power to that line in the cello. And then in the winds, we have this line in the uilleann pipes that's just kind of doing its own thing. And you can see that we're doing quite a bit of key switching. And just like with the high Irish whistles, that's just going to help you achieve a bit more realism and authenticity. So I'm actually going to go ahead and switch to the articulation matrix for the uilleann pipes so that you can see exactly what's going on. So let's go ahead and hear it with the brass and the winds. Those uilleann pipes are just absolutely stunning. I love when they come in here. They're just pure ear candy. Now, there's actually not much more going on in this section. You just have some orchestral woodwinds that are doubling some of the string parts. You've got the bassoons doubling the cello, and the flute doubling the first violin. And then you just have a little bit of driving content in the tonal hit 05 track. So let's go ahead and just hear this with everything. Now, this next phrase introduces this really beautiful preset in Hollywood Fantasy Orchestrator. This is the strings plucked unisono, and it's just very playable, very inspiring. It features the 3 dulcimers and the 3 lutes. So again, just so inspiring. So let's hear this in context with the strings. And you have the strings plucked unisono doing these rolls at the beginning of each measure. And you've got the Hardanger fiddles, which are going to be playing what is essentially the melody in this section. And then the cello are just going to be sort of playing around that melody, almost like counter melody, but not quite. And then you have the viola da gambas coming in at measure 20 on a lower harmony part with the Hardanger fiddles and the cello. So let's go ahead and hear the strings. So I think those textures just really work well together. The sparseness of the Hardanger fiddles and the viola da gambas, I think, kind of gives this section a slightly sorrowful feel, and it just really worked. So now let's add the winds, and we just have some content in the Renaissance flutes. I think these are just doubling the Hardanger fiddles. So let's go ahead and pull those up. And then you have some vocals. We've got the women's choir coming in on this ooh, and they're both doubling that melody as well as adding a harmony to it. And then you have the solo voice word patch coming in, and that's just going to be adding some texture in measures 18 through 20, and then it's joining the fiddles and the voices and the flutes on melody. And we're just kind of randomly key switching between some different words to add more texture to that melody. So let's hear everything with the vocals and the winds. So just that one solo voice is adding a lot of emotion to this section. So let's add the crotales. And these are, again, just going to add a lot of magic to this phrase. And we've got just a little bit of content in the orchestral woodwinds. It's just this one bassoon line that's coming in with the cello right there. And then we have a little bit of harp and then some tuned percussion in that percussion tonal hit 05 from Hollywood Orchestrator. So let's go ahead and just hear everything together. Now, in this next phrase, we're introducing the high strings from Hollywood Fantasy Strings, and these are violins and violas recorded in octaves. So actually, the part, if you were to visualize it, it would look something like this. I'm just going to select these, and we're going to copy and paste this. So that's actually what it would look like. But again, because they're recorded in octaves, we don't have to actually do that. Same thing for the low strings. So even though you just have 4 string tracks here, because you've got those 2 string patches that were recorded in octaves, this section just sounds so incredibly lush. And then we do have just a little bit of movement in the 3 dulcimers. Those transients are just going to kind of help drive things along and again, provide some movement for this part. So let's hear the strings. So those high strings are just so perfect. They're really ideal for those big, lush, soaring melody lines. Now in the brass, we have this preset coming in from Hollywood Fantasy Orchestrator, and this is the Brass Long Notes 01 preset, and that's being joined by the 2 French horns. So let's go ahead and solo the brass so you can hear it by itself. Really full, really lush. Now let's add the strings back in, and then we are also going to add the winds. And we just have this line in the 2 Irish whistles that's going to be doubling the high strings on melody. And let's also add the voices while we're at it. So let's go ahead and give it a listen. And then I think we only have a few other elements here. We've got some orchestral woodwinds. The English horn is just going to be doubling the viola line in the strings. And then you have some harp content. So let's go ahead and just unsolo everything and hear it all together. So even though the writing here is very simple and we only have a few tracks, it's still very effective just because of how well designed these patches are from Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra. Now, we're reintroducing the Nightfall 05 preset in Hollywood Fantasy Orchestrator at measure 33, and that's playing all the way to measure 37. And then you've got the Hardanger fiddles and viola da gambas just kind of playing around that note. And they sound really cool in this section. I just love all those textures together. And then at measure 37, you've got the full strings coming in along with the low strings. So let's go ahead and hear the strings in this section along with Nightfall 05. And now let's add the brass, and they're only coming in the second half of this phrase where it gets big. So we'll go ahead and just start right at measure 37. So we're just using the brass to kind of fill things out as we crescendo into this next section. And the low brass patch from Hollywood Fantasy Brass in particular is really just adding so much meat to this section. Next, I want to solo the Hollywood Fantasy winds just so that you can hear some of these textures by themselves. And you actually have the 2 Renaissance flutes on melody in this, at least the first part of this phrase. And then the Renaissance flutes are joined by the 2 Irish whistles. And I actually have 2 patches that are just playing harmonies. So let's go ahead and hear the winds by themselves. So in this context, they're just very delicate, very magical, just kind of otherworldly. And I want to show you what the Crotales ensemble is adding to this part just with the Hollywood Fantasy Winds. Again, it's such a beautiful texture and it really makes this part. So let's hear the winds and the Crotales. Just adding so much magic here. And then we do have a couple of lines in the orchestral woodwinds, and they're actually kind of providing a response to the line in the whistles in the previous measure. So let's go ahead and hear this part with just the winds crotales and then orchestral woodwinds. All right, and then finally, we just have some harp and then some content in the tonal hit 05 track. And that's pretty much it for this section. So let's go ahead and unsolo everything and hear it all together. So now we are kind of into the emotional heart of the piece, where we have this reprise of a melody that we heard a bit earlier on. And of course, we're going to have the high strings in Hollywood Fantasy Strings playing that melody, and the low strings are going to be playing the bass. Now, I should point out that I don't have chords in the strings simply because we've already got chordal support in the choir as well as the brass. So it might sound a little bit odd without the full chords when we solo the strings, but I think it's still good to hear this in isolation. So now let's go ahead and add the brass, and you'll get a better idea of what the melody is doing in relation to the chord structure. So you have the Wagner tubas along with the low brass playing these sustains, again, just kind of providing that chord structure. And then you have the flugelhorns coming in at measure 45, joining the high strings on melody. And they just add such a cool texture in that part. And then we do have some content in the 6 French horns as well. And this is helping to complete the chord and also add just a little bit of movement in these chord stacks. So let's go ahead and hear the strings with the brass. So nothing too complicated here. The writing is fairly simple. Most of the magic is just coming from these incredible sounds. So now let's go ahead and add the choir. And this is really just going to further define that chord structure, but it's also going to add so much magic and power in this section. Definitely be listening out for when the women's choir specifically comes in at measure 45. It's just absolutely breathtaking. It's going to be joining the strings on melody there. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and add the harp and tuned percussion as well. So let's go ahead and hear all of this together. And we're going to go a couple bars out just so you can get the lead up to this part. So there are really only a few other elements that we need to talk about. So let's just unsolo everything. And let's start with the percussion here at measure 41. You've got some cymbal swells as well as some crashes here at measure 41 and 45. So just be listening for those. And then you also have this little cymbal swell going into the outro. You've got some Celesta along with the harp in that outro. And then we do also have, of course, the crotales, as well as the orchestral bell ensemble. And these are just incredible. It's a really special patch. I want you to hear these by themselves. They just sound so magical and powerful. Because it's not just a single bell playing, you get this beautiful stereo image. It's so lush, and it adds so much to this section. So even though they're fairly subtle, you can still feel them in the mix, and they add a lot. And then finally, at the end, you have this little outro in the Irish whistles, and that sounds like this by itself. And I should point out that those are, of course, the low Irish whistles. And then we have Nightfall 05 coming in for that outro, as well as the strings plucked unisono, both from Hollywood Fantasy Orchestrator. So together with the whistles, they sound like this. And now let's go ahead and hear everything together. And again, we're going to start 2 bars out so that you can get the crescendo into this section. So even though the writing here is fairly simple and we're not even using that many tracks, it's still highly effective because we're working with these sounds and these textures that are just so beautiful and inspirational. So of course, the full completed Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra suite is for sale on our website right now, and that does include the Hollywood Fantasy Orchestrator, which, as you saw in this video, is such a powerful tool, but it's also just part of the Composer Cloud Plus subscription. So if you liked this video, don't forget to drop a comment, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. All of us here at East West would also like to wish you happy holidays and a very Merry Christmas. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.